Okay, so I think we're recording.
Okay.
I'll start by introducing myself. So I'm Dr. Anna Tarrant. I'm an associate professor in sociology at the University of Lincoln, and I'm also the director of a qualitative longitudinal study called Following Young Fathers Further. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Dr. Karen Hughes. I'm Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Leeds, and I'm Director of the Timescapes Archive.
Great, hi. And together we have published the book Qualitative Secondary Analysis, haven't we? And we've published that with Sage, and we did that to really showcase advances in the field. While we look predominantly in the chapters at researchers and how researchers use existing qualitative data, we've also got a chapter in there by Maureen Harker, which looks at the value of qualitative secondary analysis for teaching.
Yes.
So what we'd like to focus on in this session, and we speak predominantly here to dissertation students, is why might you use existing data, existing qualitative research data in your dissertation?
Yeah, I think, I mean, some of these questions have been prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
So they have become particularly pertinent in 2020 and now in 2021. But I think that it's qualitative secondary analysis is a bit of a missed trick in dissertation research more generally. Because, I mean, in the context of COVID, where people can't do in-person research, they can do face-to-face, such as over Zoom and Teams and things like that. But in-person research becomes quite difficult. So how do we get hold of first-hand accounts at a distance? And obviously those are in archives and repositories in some form or another. But I think more generally, qualitative secondary analysis is a missed trick for dissertation students, because often in the confines of either an undergraduate or a master's dissertation, there's such a short space for fieldwork. There's like 6 weeks for undergraduates and 3 months, I think, for master's students. So there's not very much time to get hold of people. And it's quite possible to register for archives such as the UK Data Service or the Timescapes archive, those sorts of archives that contain research data. And because those are research data, that means that the research studies have been through ethics approval for a start. So all the ethical concerns have been attended to by the originating researchers of gathering data with a particular group of people. The questions have been formulated by people who are generally pretty expert in their field. So they know the literature already, and so those questions that have been developed in relation to a broader set of literature. They have been through all the pains and heartaches of recruitment. So accessing through gatekeepers, getting hold of people, convincing those people of the value of research, and so on and so forth. If they've used interview-based research methods, or even if they've used visual methods or whatever, all those technological difficulties, the videos have been recorded, or the pictures have been digitized, or the interviews have been recorded, everything's been transcribed professionally, so the transcripts are whole, they don't need further transcription. And commonly the questions throughout the interview have been asked by an expert interviewer. So the accounts that people generate have been, they've been generated really, really skillfully and really well, because even if the field workers are a novice in field work, they're supported by other people in a research team who train them in those skills of interview elicitation or data elicitation in interview. So what that means is when you access a data set, you access, for example, interview data that have been produced to a really high standard. They've already been transcribed. And in a sense, in one sense, although we raised so many cautions about this, they're ready to use. Um, we say ready to use. Not
essentially it's the raw data, isn't it?
It is the raw data. It is the raw data. And just to say, we are going to also, this is a video that has a companion video on what the challenges of qualitative secondary analysis are. So some of these, why isn't it directly just ready to use? Why can't I just take it off a shelf and use it directly?
Yeah.
We're going to deal with that in the other one. The thing about it is that also qualitative secondary analysis is, I mean, this is stuff that I've done on my own data. And I've told you so many times about, I was doing a study on internet gambling. At the same time as setting up the study in timescapes in midlife grandparents living in, circumstances of poverty. And we had gathered all the data from the internet gambling study. And I set up the midlife grandparent study and came back to do the data analysis. And I was quite familiar with the transcripts already, but suddenly all these grandparents fell out of the interviews because I had been alerted to the questions and concerns of grandparents by setting up this other study. But the first time round, I hadn't seen grandparents at all, hadn't noticed them at all. They weren't on my agenda. So even within my own data, I mean, you and I, we're continuing to work on quite small portions of data from existing data sets.
So rich, isn't it?
They're so rich.
Yeah.
But these data can't be exhausted. That's the other thing. So for the purposes of a dissertation, if they're generally in your field of interest in that area, if you're interested in something about families or something in family contexts, you're likely to have access to it in some way in a research study on people in families, So even, for example, if the study is on the making of modern motherhood, that there will be stuff about dads in there. There will be stuff about being kids. It's an intergenerational study, so there'll be stuff about being a mum, being a grandmother, being a daughter, and so on and so forth. And we found that in our own research, that there's in stuff on being a midlife grandparent, there's so much on being a grandchild, being a dad, being a husband, being a wife, stuff about uncles. So all of those sorts of family relationships, we hold those identities within ourselves. We have multiple generational identities anyway. And so do the people in our research data. So if you're interested in family stuff, data sets on family will have something to offer you. Those data can't be exhausted either.
That's right. So because we found that in my research, didn't we? So your project was actually quite orientated around the grandmothers' voices.
Yes,
and the analyses were predominantly orientated in that way as well. But my interests in coming to that data were around men, low-income fatherhood, fatherhood across the life course. And there were whole interviews in there with grandfathers that hadn't been subject to depth analyses. They were talked about a little bit in publications, but I was able to develop, a whole study design and a whole set of publications just around the data with the men in that study. And I think in debates around archiving, can be a fear, I think, from researchers about letting go of their data and what more can be said from it. But whenever we've dealt with data in our teaching, for example, students always come back at us with something completely new and expect. And that's the beauty, if you like, of qualitative data, qualitative analysis, because you can use different methods of analysis. So you can use discourse analysis, content analysis, thematic analysis, whatever orientation it is that you have, and come up with so many different interpretations that are still valid and still produce knowledge and contribute to the way we theorize about the social world.
There's a classic example. So on the Timescapes Archive website under teaching resources, there's a report that was produced by a cohort of students, so a student on one module, who all did secondary analysis on some of the Timescapes archive data in Southampton, and they came up with a whole new set of findings. So the students actually were able to produce a report which came up with new findings on those data, and the module was led by somebody who had been involved in those studies. So there was all this new stuff, and I have to say, even in seminars with like 1 page or 2 pages of data extracts, students come up with something novel. They come up with a question which is like, wow, yeah, actually I hadn't thought that either. Always. It's very exciting.
Certainly at Lincoln we have a kind of an ethos called the student as producer, and that's based on Mike Neary's work, who was a professor at Lincoln. And this idea students contribute knowledge. It's not just this kind of passive teaching, learning experience at a university. And certainly, analysis of qualitative data through dissertations or through modules is something that's encouraged. And through that, we learn a heck of a lot as well.
Well, we do. And so, I mean, in terms of QSA for dissertations, that is absolutely the case. It's not simply because somebody else has already analysed it that they've extracted all the meaning from it.
Yeah.
You can do a dissertation and you can come up with something that's absolutely startling or very challenging for the originating researchers.
Yeah.
You can come up with new stuff all the time because you're coming to it at a new moment in time. Then there may be, a number of years have passed, the debates have changed, and you're able to look back at those data in the context of a different world view. So those data are going to speak to you in a very distinctive way, depending on where you are in time as well. And as you said, we were going in and we were looking at it wasn't consciously. We didn't even know that we were looking more at what the women were saying. Women are much more articulate, I think, in the interviews. But as you say, you went in and you looked specifically at what was it the men were saying and brought a gendered analysis. We'd never done a gendered analysis on our data. We had avoided that, to be honest. So you coming in told us something about our data that was very, very new and made us look at our participants in new ways. And just to say, I mean, you and I are going back now for a project ourselves, and we're looking at these data. And I'm looking at an interview with a young man who originally I read his interview transcript as an ex-heroin user. And now, because of your research, I'm now looking at him as a young dad, because he's a young dad with custody of his daughter. And I hadn't even noticed that he had a daughter. First time round. I'm sure I did, but it didn't actually, in terms of what I thought about the interview and what evidence I thought it constituted, the daughter did not figure at all. And it's so I'm now going back to the interview as this guy is now no longer a heroin user or ex-heroin user or whatever. He's a young dad.
Yeah, and this has led us to think through methodological questions, hasn't it, about the lenses that we bring to data as researchers. We bring particular questions, we're orientated to data in a particular way, and QSA opens up a world of new possibilities for different research.
I mean, and we're going to talk about this in the challenges of QSA. It's like, what sort of evidence are they? What sort of questions? How can we harness certain sorts of challenges of going to data that was produced perhaps at a different time for different purposes by different people? How can we harness questions of difference, or as we describe, we talk about distance, don't we, or remove from the data? How can we make that work for us? So the example with time earlier on was a good one, but this example of new ways of thinking, that's another one. I've got new interests, or I'm sensitized to different sorts of narratives in the data because of research that I've done since I did that original research.
Absolutely.
So
and I think
I'm just thinking for a dissertation student with their whole completely different worldview that they're going to bring to these data, they're going to read those data in a way that I never dreamt of or imagined. I'll never be able to conceive of the data in the way that they do.
Yeah, and I think just one point to sort of conclude with really is that there's an interdisciplinary appeal to these approaches. So we're sociologists, but we draw on a range of different disciplines to develop our ideas and develop knowledge through data. But we've started working increasingly with geographers. We could work with criminologists. Psychologists might be interested in that data. Any qualitative researcher interested in using that data can bring different perspectives to that data, and it
absolutely
may be able to speak to those questions.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you.